Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome again Professor Elizabeth Schmidt. She is a former uh, history teacher at Loyola University, Maryland. Miss um, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining me again under the Human Rights Tree.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm honored to have been invited twice.
Thank you. I know during your career, you wrote many books.
Uh-huh.
And today among them is Decoding Corporate Camouflage, U.S. Business Support for Apartheid.
That's right.
I
Yes.
would love to basically invite you to discuss about that book and go deep into knowing the reason why you write the book and what was the
Okay.
impact of the book in South Africa and around the world.
Okay.
Um, my first question will be, were you born an activist?
Yeah, I was sort of weaned an activist. My parents, I was born in the 1950s, came of age in the 1960s and 70s, which was a time of real progressive activism in the US, the civil rights movement, the free speech movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And my parents were extremely involved in the civil rights and anti-war movement. So um, I wasn't what they call a red diaper baby when your parents are members of the US Communist Party, but my parents were and still are very progressive. And so it came very naturally to me. We had dinner table conversations about the Vietnam War, and I would go home and talk to my middle school classes and classmates who supported the war, and I would give them all the reasons why it was wrong and talked about imperialism. So in a way, I was born an activist, yeah.
I see. If I'm not mistaken, your major was African studies. Is
No,
it?
well, not as an undergraduate. My
Mm,
university degree, my first degree was I majored in American history,
okay.
and it never occurred to me that I would go in this direction. That all happened in the couple years after I graduated from university.
But when did your study on focusing on African study came?
Oh, okay. Well, the book that I'm going to talk about is the first book that I wrote, and I started working on it when I was 23 years old, so
Okay.
a couple
Mm,
years out of university. And I absolutely decided at that point, and I'll explain, as I answer further questions, how I came to work on that book and develop that idea. But that's what propelled me into the desire to pursue in-depth African studies. And I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and got a doctorate. And I often describe it as I went to get my union card because as a young person without a degree beyond the university, and not having studied Africa formally at university, I was finding it very hard to get and keep jobs. And so I knew that this is what I wanted to do. And to do that, I might as well get a doctorate. So
We
that's how
know
that.
we know your book Decoding Corporate Camouflage is related to South Africa.
That's right.
So how was your perceptions of South Africa before you start
Okay.
writing that book, the
Okay.
book? Mm,
Well, in college, I did actually take one course on Africa, and it
mm.
was a course called Modern African Liberation Movements, interestingly taught by the professor of Japanese history, because in the
Okay.
United States in those times, everything was American and European history. That's all people studied, and as colleges began to increase, the variety of their curriculum, realizing we need to talk about the global South. Um, they would hire someone who was a specialist in China or Japan or Latin America, and so we referred to those people as the West and the rest. And so my
Okay.
college didn't have a historian of Africa, so they assigned it randomly to the Japanese historian, like that was going to be helpful. But at any rate,
Okay.
his course was actually very good, but it ended with the banning of the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1960. I
Okay.
was taking this course in the spring of 1976.
Mm,
And so I left the course thinking, gee, all quiet on the South African front. Nothing's going on. These major parties that became liberation movements are everyone's in prison or in exile or has been killed by the apartheid regime. Now, of course, as most of your listeners will know, the Soweto uprising, the young high school students who rose up in Soweto, was in June 1976. So
Okay.
a month after I finished college, or I finished that year of college, the Soweto exploded. And so when I got to Washington after college, I was working for nonprofit organizations focusing on human rights and U.S. foreign policy. And I was working for an organization where they had, various chapters. Okay, how are we reacting to the Philippines? How are we reacting to Indonesia, which had dictatorships? How are we reacting to South Africa? So I said, oh, I'd really like to do the South Africa case study. And so my sister, who lived in New York, said, why don't you come up, spend some time with me, and do research at the American Committee on Africa? And that was a really important advocacy group and information clearinghouse on progressive change in South Africa, in what was then white ruled Southern Rhodesia. Now it's Zimbabwe, Namibia, the former Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique. So they were focusing on getting the American public more involved and in opposition to these forces. So I was there doing research, and after I was there a few days, a very imposing, big, friendly African American man came by and he said, Sister, what's that you're working on so hard? So I told him what I was doing, and he said, well, that's really important. You ought to send it to me when you're done. So I did. And about a month or two later, I got a phone call from him in Washington, and he had taken a job at the Institute for Policy Studies, which was a left-wing think tank. And he was working on something called the Africa Project. And one thing led to another, and eventually he offered me a job. Very low level, very low paying job. But
What was his name?
his name, oh, thank you. That's very important because he changed my life. Prexy Nesbitt.
Okay.
And he's from Chicago.
Mm.
He right now he's living in Minnesota, but he's lived in Chicago most of his life. And he was a community organizer. He worked for Harold Washington's office when Washington was mayor. He was a member of the Black Panther Party. And then he was also deeply engaged in Southern African solidarity support, for all those countries, colonies that I was mentioning. And had various jobs where he worked on this, the World Council of Churches Program to Combat Racism, American Committee on Africa, Institute for Policy Studies, you name it, he's worked there. And he's one of these very inspiring people who really had a penchant for turning young people on to activism and making them believe they could do something to make a difference. And he never mentioned, you need university degrees, you never need a doctorate. It's just do this. And so I did it with no self-consciousness at all about my lack of qualifications, and he was encouraging me. And I often say to people, if he'd been working on something else, if he'd been working on El Salvador or Cuba, that's probably what I'd be doing today,
I see.
because it was really his inspiration that, channeled me into South Africa.
Mm.
So when I got, I'm
Are
sorry.
you still in touch? Mhm.
Oh yeah, yeah. I talk to him all the time. I see him all the time. The African Studies Association is going to be meeting in Chicago in December, and he's going to come down. There's a tribute to him at
Okay.
African Studies. Yeah. Um, and
Could be an opportunity of meeting you guys.
yeah. Well, we're going to be at the Marriott.
Okay.
At any rate, yeah, it's a big deal. Yeah, I'm still very much in touch with him, and call him, and we share information still back and forth, and that sort of thing. But what he said to me when I got there is, now your first assignment is to tear apart the Sullivan Principles. This was this fair employment code that corporations were adopting in order to justify their continued presence in South Africa.
Mhm.
And a lot of churches and trade unions and African-American activist groups were arguing that they needed to pack up and withdraw from South Africa. The boycott, divest, sanctions movement, began there. It didn't begin with Israel. It really began with the South African case. And the corporations, of course, did not want to leave South Africa because it was lucrative. It was a very repressed, cheap labor economy, and they were making huge profits. So like 180 of the US's 350 Fortune 500, I'm sorry, 180 of the 500 Fortune 500 companies were doing business in South Africa. And colleges and universities and city governments, local governments, pension funds were all invested, in these very prosperous companies. And so the last thing they wanted to do was to leave. And so they eventually came up with the idea that, if they threw out some superficial reforms, that possibly they could, justify their presence. They could say, "Oh, we're doing these things for Black workers that, nobody else is doing." But at any rate, I had encountered the Sullivan Principles before I got the job.
Mm.
And that was the era when the Equal Employment Opportunity Act was passed in the U.S., and in the midst of the civil rights movement, and so I was familiar with the idea of, desegregation and more job training, more advancement, more appointments of Blacks in supervisory and managerial positions. And, obviously I thought in the US, that's a good thing. We really need that. In the aftermath of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we needed regulations to make sure these things are implemented. So anyway, I didn't want to admit to Prexy that I didn't see anything wrong with the principles because I was thinking, with my American perspective.
Mm.
And so I thought, well, if he says there's something wrong, and I better find it out quickly. Because 3 weeks later, he was going up to a major meeting of African American ministers who were having a summit conference in New York in the spring of 1979. And this conference was led by those ministers who'd been involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King. I mean, so these are the really high-powered ministers of huge African American churches. And the man who devised the Fair Employment Code, Reverend Leon Sullivan, was going to be there. And he was going to give the keynote speaker. And he had a massive church in Philadelphia, right? So very, very popular, very highly regarded. And Sullivan has some interesting history. He had been very much in favor of corporate withdrawal from South Africa initially. And he was courted to join the board of directors of General Motors Corporation, a big U.S. firm. And when he did, he put forth a proposed resolution to withdraw from South Africa. And of course, GM had no intention of doing that. And they kept putting him off. And finally, Reverend Sullivan's colleagues in the civil rights movement said, "Leon, you better come up with something or get off the board. They're using you." And so he came up with this Fair Employment Code as an alternative to corporate withdrawal. And what Prexy wanted me to do was show what a sham it was, that it wasn't addressing the fundamental structures of apartheid. It wasn't just, segregation or what we would call the Jim Crow laws in the US South, but it was depriving Africans of their birthright citizenship. They were not considered citizens of South Africa. They were considered citizens of these little reservations where they couldn't possibly survive. Their 3/4 of the population was being confined to 13% of the land. And of course, that meant that able-bodied working age adult men would migrate out and work in the white areas for 11 months out of the year and go home and see their families once a year. And they worked for pitiful low wages. So that, and there was no constitution that offered theoretical protection because they had no rights. So it would be like the US before the Civil War, right?
Yeah, but
Go
before
ahead.
going to the Sullivan Principles.
Yeah,
I would like to, because you decided eventually to write the book,
right,
Decoding Corporate Camouflage.
right.
Did you only, to write the book, did you base your book on research, or did you decided to go to South Africa and see it yourself and start writing? What?
Okay. Okay. That's a great question because, as now a trained historian, I know that it's very, very important to go and conduct oral interviews. That's been the backbone of three of my books.
Okay.
One on Zimbabwe, where I went right after they got majority rule, and two on Guinea, Guinea Conakry.
Mm.
And so I did archival research for those books and oral interviews in the country, and also in France in the case of Guinea, and in
Mm.
Britain in the case of Zimbabwe. Um, but this book was actually written before I ever went to South Africa, and it
Okay.
was based on primarily compliance reports that I should not have gotten a hold of, that they were circumscribed documents that were leaked to me.
Mm.
And each of these large companies that signed the Sullivan Principles code had to have fill out monitoring reports every 6 months, but they were self-monitored. And so, that was like the basis of what I did. And then they also had a consulting firm that put together these fancy public reports, and I used those. And then I had a lot of newspaper articles and work that I'd done at the American Committee on Africa. But the main thing was the Sullivan Principles reports motor vehicles like Ford, General Motors, petroleum like Caltex, Mobil, Exxon, computers like Hewlett Packard, and various other computer companies. Because they were running the pass laws, they were running the prison system, they were supplying vehicles to the military and the police. I mean, all of these corporations were deeply engaged in perpetuating the structure of apartheid and bolstering the regime, bank loans from Citibank. Um, so that's what I used. And my argument was that these are self-reporting. And so there's nobody making sure that they're telling the truth.
Mm.
So this is the best we can possibly expect is happening on the ground. I mean, they're going to only report their victories. And then after I wrote the book, I did go to South Africa on a secret mission where I was sort of underground. I had a new passport with my first initial, my middle name, and my last name. And that was before all these things were totally computerized. And I used my parents' address in Connecticut and went to the New York consulate um, um, to get my visa, and I got a tourist visa. So I wasn't using my Washington, D.C. address or going to the embassy down in D.C., which is what they would have expected. And then for a tourist visa, they ask if you've ever written or published anything. And I said, no. And so I got in, and I was there for 3 months, and I went all over the country as well as to Namibia, which was still occupied by South Africa, Lesotho, which was totally surrounded by South Africa. And there were a lot of exiles, Zimbabwe and Tanzania and Zambia, where a lot of exiles were, and a lot of the especially the ANC. And so I did lots of interviewing after the book came out, including trade unionists who really scoffed at it and said, why don't they just recognize trade unions and let us collectively bargain? We don't need some outsider from a corporate board telling us what we want and what we need. And we know they're just there to perpetuate the system. So I wrote some addenda to Decoding Corporate Camouflage that
I
came out as little pamphlets after
see.
the fact. Yeah,
So you wrote the book, and after that you decided to go underground, a
to South Africa.
visit to South
Yeah, yeah,
Africa.
yeah.
For many people who were born after apartheid, they really
Mm.
don't know what apartheid
Yeah.
was about. Can you tell us can you share, you know, your life experience living in a country that adopted the apartheid system?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I wouldn't say living since I was only there 3 months, but I certainly I felt what it felt like to be a white person there, that at least on the surface, people were incredibly African Americans. Africans were very respectful,
Mm,
often didn't look me in the eye, looked down, which was a show of, honoring an elder, even though I was often their junior. Um, um, really went out of their way to be helpful to me. But I also got a glimpse of how this is just play acting, because I did meet people who knew that what I was doing and what I was up to. And at one point, one of them was invited to the home of a sort of patron that they had, um, um, who was a white South African who considered herself quite liberal. And she was so paternalistic and so patronizing in the way she spoke to them, that when they were served a plate that had a meat dish, the woman grabbed the knife and fork from the African man and said, "This is how you cut it. This is the fork you use to eat it." They had an array of forks and spoons of different sizes, and I was so embarrassed. And he just said, "Oh, yes, madam, thank you very much." And as soon as we left that evening and got into the elevator and started leaving, he burst into tears. I mean, he burst into laughter. He started mimicking what she had said in his response. And you could tell that it was all just a joke. And so I assumed that that's what people thought of me too, unless they learned otherwise. And it was a very uncomfortable position for me to be in, because I felt like, no, people aren't going to talk candidly with me. And I later found out that when some people had talked frankly with me, they had vetted me first. They'd gone to people that they knew were in the know. And some people knew about my book. And they said, "Yeah, she's okay. You can talk to her."
mm,
And the chore was made more difficult because it was right after Ronald Reagan was elected to the presidency in the US. And he was very close to the South African regime.
So,
Um, and
so,
and really changed the policy in that direction to favor them even more than Nixon had.
I
But coming right after Jimmy Carter, who still was a problematic person in that regard, he walked the he talked the talk. He didn't necessarily walk the walk. That is Jimmy Carter, but Reagan was just outright, on the side of the whites, and believed the propaganda that anyone opposing apartheid was a communist and a stooge of Moscow.
okay.
So yeah, it was awkward, and I didn't really realize how awkward until I went to Zimbabwe a little bit better because there was majority rule and people are now feeling very frank, but older people still had that veneer of obsequiousness. But when I went to Guinea, it was a totally different experience because I was married to a Guinean man,
Mm.
and people teased me a lot, and said, I was their wife, and his uncles would tell me to go get water and wash their feet, and I said, well, you didn't pay bride wealth, and so and you've got to pay for all the degrees that I have, and so we joked back and forth, and his grandmother would play like she was jealous of me, right, because of the grandmother grandson,
I see.
joking relationship. And so she was treating me like a competitor, and we had a lot of fun with that.
I,
But I felt for the first time I was never going to be an insider, but I realized how much of an outsider I'd been in Southern Africa
I
with the
see.
white minority governments not far in the past or still present.
So when did you go there? And what was the month?
South
And
Africa.
yeah,
I went there in May 1981.
okay. Um, to go around,
Yeah,
based on your introduction, you need black people needed a pass because I
right.
don't know how. I just want to know how the apartheid regime was able to implement that political system based on apartheid and deal with the economical consequences. How they were able to create a balance because they don't want to associate with the blacks. They wanted the separation of races.
Right.
But in some time, the economical demand need
Right.
cheap labor, and
Right.
they needed the black to work for them. So how
That's
were they able to come up with a strategy
ah.
to balance that and be able to succeed on that model?
Right. That's an excellent question. Well, if you take the United States as an example, we depend very much on labor, especially on farms in the American Southwest, but also road work, construction, all over the country on migrant labor from South and Central America. But we don't give them citizenship. We don't give them any rights. But we need their cheap labor, and they do jobs that American citizens would not want to do. I mean, there are American citizens who would rather remain unemployed than do the kind of backbreaking, low-paid, no prestige work that those immigrants do. So they're temporary residents here on work contracts. Similarly, if you look at our healthcare system, many of the nursing aides, that aides for the elderly, people who work the night shift in the emergency room are from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. And they're people who have, very important credentials, some of which they got in their home countries and some of which they got in the United States. But they are left doing the jobs, even those who are physicians, MDs, they do jobs that people who were born in the US and go to the prestigious medical schools would not want to do. They wouldn't want to take the night shift in the emergency room. They'd rather be a dermatologist or a plastic surgeon or, some of these really lucrative kinds of doctors. So our urban healthcare system, our deeply rural, poor area healthcare system would collapse without these immigrants. And most of them are not citizens. A lot of them don't have green cards. They're kind of here at the pleasure of the United States. South Africa did the same thing, but they fabricated a myth, well, as we did with Native Americans, that they weren't citizens. Native Americans weren't citizens of the US until the 1920s. But the Africans had been the first on the land, and then they were told, no, you're not a citizen of the South African state. You're a citizen of these Bantu stands that they were called derisively, but they were like reservations. We're letting you come in to work, but when there's no work, or if you're not coming in legally, you don't have an employer, you've got to leave, you've got to go back to your home country. And they were actually even trying to grant statehood to these Bantu stands, but they set up puppet governments and all kinds of things. So they were collaborators with the white regime who were, African, but profiting off the system, just like, the military and the police did. And no country in the world recognized the legitimacy of those as states different from South Africa. So that's what they did. And so they said, well, if you're a temporary worker and we're allowing you in to work this job, if you lose your job, you get deported back to the reservation. And that's what they did. So they said, oh yeah, we really don't want integration, but we do need the labor. I mean, they would admit that. And so for the time being, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to bring them in temporarily. And they got horrible wages and lived under terrible conditions in barracks, and disease was rampant, and lots of problems with alcohol because alcohol was sold to them on payday, and the beer halls were owned by the government that used the profits to run the apartheid system. It was a really devious thing. And then they started passing more and more security laws that cracked down more and more on civil liberties. The Suppression of Communism Act in 1950 defined communism as any kind of activity that disrupted the public order. So a strike could be considered an act of communism. communism. A protest against the past law is considered an act of communism. And then more and more laws were passed throughout the 50s and early 60s, the Internal Security Act, the Sabotage Act, and everything was defined as just like a minor protest against the government. Became, a capital offense. Calling for economic sanctions was a capital offense that could receive the death penalty.
Mm, I
So,
see.
they went in that direction, and goes to show that it could happen anywhere.
So, as a white female, were you able to go everywhere you want? And if you wanted to visit different places, what did you need to be
Uh,
able to do that?
okay, good point. Too was supposed to get a pass to go into the black areas. So this would be the black urban townships that had very few permanent residents, but they certainly had some. I mean, people who had lived there before some of these laws were passed were allowed to stay. But it was very hard to get permission for their wives and children to come from the rural areas and join them after a certain point. But they didn't really want white people to see what the situation was, and they certainly didn't want us talking to trade unionists and community activists and church people in those areas. So I should have gotten a pass to go in, but I didn't,
I see.
because I knew if I applied for one, the police would be following me. And eventually, they did figure out what I was doing. I mean, I did some things that were not exactly behind closed doors. I went to the inauguration of a black trade union. It was just being founded and celebrated. And it was in a black township outside of Port Elizabeth, which is the Detroit of South Africa, where the motor vehicles industry held sway. And so I went to this trade union meeting, and the only other white people I saw there were members of the press. And so I'm sure the police thought, who the hell is she? And excuse me. And because shortly after that, I found that I was being followed by the police. Like if I went to an internal airport, when I got out, there was an unmarked police car following me to see where I went, to see who I talked to. And then at one point in King Williamstown, which is where Steve Biko was from, the Black consciousness leader,
Mm,
um, I was staying with some Irish priests, and they were very opposed to apartheid. So I was staying with them. And the first day when I got there, one of the priests came out, and he'd been alerted by a nun in Port Elizabeth that I would be coming, but he didn't know anything about me because you don't say those things on the phone, which is tapped. And
mm,
so he said, "Who are you?" And so I told him my name. He said, "No, no, no, I know your name, but who are you?" And he said, "The police have surrounded my house." And I had, my untrained eye, I didn't recognize that there are all these unmarked cars like parked up and down the street.
okay.
And so we went out at midnight. We'd climb over the back churchyard fence, and he'd take me out and show me around the town. But we never went out the front door, and they stayed as long as I stayed. So when he felt like it was finally time for me to go on to my next destination, I got in the back of his pickup truck. He put a bunch of blankets over me and drove me out and drove me to East London, which was kind of my next stop. And when I left the country, and then I started getting phone calls from the police. They'd say they were the travel agent, and they needed to know where I was going to be every step of the way until I left. I thought, yeah, right, the travel agent. And so I thought I'd better not fly out through the main airport in Johannesburg, because they're going to take all my film, they're going to take all my notes. And I'd sent copies of my notes home in air letters, and my parents had gotten most of them. So I knew I wouldn't lose much, but I didn't want to endanger people.
Mm,
So I gave my notebooks and my film to some lay Catholic women who, again, were very progressive, very active in opposition to apartheid. And after I left and had gotten back to the US, they gave it to a tourist who was not politically involved, and they mailed it to me from London.
I see.
But but they were waiting. I suspect they were waiting for me at the airport, and I went out in a passenger car over, into Zimbabwe. And then when I got to grad school in Wisconsin, I had a lot of problems related to the security police. I got lots of really threatening phone calls But then they also said the Secret Service came to see me and said that they'd gotten, they needed to interview me. And when they came down to interview me, they said they had word that I was being accused of being involved in a plot with the African National Congress to kill President Reagan. And of course I wasn't. And I would never even joke about that, and when people start saying things now about various political figures, and I say, just be quiet, just don't go down that road.
Mhm.
So they were really trying to scare me, and they did, but I still kept on working in the anti-apartheid movement after I got back.
I see. How old were you? And um, your journey, was it um, a journey of fear or a journey of
Uh,
excitement in South Africa?
yeah. Was it a journey of fear or a journey of what?
Excitement.
Excitement.
Like
I was 24. I was
I'm doing
24.
doing
Yeah.
something purpose with
Yeah.
purpose and guided
Yeah.
by purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, I was 24 years old. It was exciting. I was just learning so much, and I just couldn't believe I was able to have this experience. I wasn't expecting it. The trip came up very last minute. I wasn't supposed to go alone. I was supposed to go with the photographer, the editor of a Catholic mission magazine. It was called Mary Knoll Magazine. And when they applied for their visas, they explained that they were editors of a Catholic publication. They were asked to produce evidence from it, articles from it. They chose, without consulting me, to um, provide the only issue they'd ever written about South Africa, in which they called for economic sanctions. And
Mm.
gee, they never got visas. They were never turned down, but they never got visas. And I thought, oh my gosh. And they said, and their trip is only to be 3 weeks. And they said to me, are you willing to go alone? And I said, yeah, I really was. And instead of staying in the big hotels, I wound up, after the first couple days, staying with different people across the country. And so I really wasn't spending much money. And they were setting me up with the next group to see in the next city. And so I stayed for 3 months. That was sort of my own decision. I was scared some of the times. I declined a couple of invitations where I thought, ooh, that's just not safe. For instance, to go into one of the reservations when I was surrounded by the police, the Irish priest said, he could get me in there. And I said, but after that, nobody's expecting me. No one will know if I don't show up. And South Africa was notorious for car accidents against activists.
Okay.
Similarly, I went to occupied Namibia, which was undergoing a war with South Africa. And someone said they could take me from the capital where I was situated to the war zone. And as much as I thought, well, that would be interesting, I decided to decline that one. But I think in retrospect, knowing what I now know about apartheid, is I was probably pretty foolish. I mean, I probably took risks that I never should have, but I was under the false impression that, oh, well, as an American citizen, they wouldn't touch me. All they do is deport me,
Mm.
which was, more often than the case in those days than it would be now. I mean, now there are a lot of groups that would consider it a victory to kill American citizens,
I
but that
see.
that wasn't really yet happening. But there was always that danger of a car accident.
I see.
So anyway, I would die if my own son wanted to do something like this.
I see. Decoding corporate camouflage. How did you come up with that title, U.S. Business Support for Apartheid?
Yeah.
How
Well, I
does
was trying to strip away the window dressing and expose the charade that the fair employment principles were. So that's decoding this camouflage that the corporations are covering their mission with. I mean, that they say, oh, we're a progressive force for change. If we pay our Black workers more and let them use the same bathrooms, it's a step towards ending apartheid. And I wanted to show how, one, the corporations are supporting the most strategic sectors of the economy, and that is not touched by. In fact, it's protected by the Fair Employment Code, because they can say they're doing these things that are progressive and justify their presence and get pressure off their backs, because many colleges and universities began to sign to divest from companies that didn't sign the code, but all these companies had signed the code, and so they were trying to sort of break up. The colleges were break up the boycott, sanctions, divestment movement. They use the Sullivan Principles to do it. The second thing that I did in using those compliance reports was show what a sham it was, even if the Sullivan Principles would work, to undermine the structures of apartheid, that they were affecting 0.2% of the African labor force in South Africa. 0.2%. And
Before we go there,
yeah,
what are
yeah.
the principles?
Oh, okay.
What are the Sullivan Principles?
Okay, I can read them. There's 6 of them. Well, I'll just tell you what I'm remembering because I'm trying to see where I've got them in my book here. It's desegregation of the workplace, job training and advancement, hiring more Africans in managerial and supervisory positions. Well, there are 6 of them, and I'm not going to name them all. And then contributing to a better environment outside the workplace. So contributing to schools, community groups, housing, that kind of thing. So and I forgot to say desegregation of the workforce. So the workplace. So, for instance, if the bathrooms were all segregated under South African law, there was a bathroom for blacks, a bathroom for whites. And so some of the corporations were saying, okay, we'll take down those whites only, blacks only sign, and they put up color codes, blue for the whites, orange for the blacks. Duh, I mean, there's no difference. And then when that was General Motors that did that. When that was cottoned on to, they said, okay, well, then we'll have a cafeteria for the hourly paid workers and a cafeteria for the salary paid workers, right? And so obviously with blacks doing mostly unskilled labor, they were paid by the hour, and whites in the professional and managerial classes were getting salaries. So that didn't do much to desegregate the bathrooms and the cafeterias. So then job training and advancement, none of the compliance reports showed how many whites were advantaged by the job training and advancement and how many blacks were. And it turns out that the people being trained for higher level jobs were predominantly white. And that does not show up in the overall compliance report that was released to the public. But I was able to find that in the individual company reports that had been leaked to me. And so I could show what a sham that was. Managerial positions, they wouldn't say how many managerial positions they had that blacks occupied in the corporation, but they would use percentages. So if they had one black manager who was, say, manager of the cafeteria, and they hired a second black manager in a similarly kind of low-level managerial position, they would say in their report, this year our employment of black managers increased by 100%. Whereas, there might be thousands of white managers, and as they say, you can make statistics say anything you want. And that's what they did. And they did that mostly by obscuring numbers and using percentages instead. And, and so I was showing how each of the companies that, I used as case studies for the motor vehicles industry, the petroleum products industry, the computer industry. And I showed how they were considered to be making good progress in implementing the Sullivan Principles. They were bolstering the most strategic sectors of the South African economy. And yet good progress was defined as, increasing the managerial from 1 to 2. And in terms of helping schools and helping the community, white schools were helped too. And there was no breakdown in the public report about how much of the money went to the white schools that were already getting significantly more from the government than Black schools. Which again, that's mirrored in the United States, inner city, predominantly minority schools compared to the white suburbs. It's hard to believe it's the same educational system. So I was trying to do two things: show what a sham the principles were, even in terms of the sort of equal employment opportunity that we know in the U.S. that they really weren't doing much. And secondly, how the corporations that were presented as doing the best were those that were doing the most to support apartheid. That so is that kind of thing.
But
Oh, and
many,
one other thing was the companies, I mentioned that these are voluntary self-monitoring reports. I mean, they were considered mandatory, but nothing was done if they weren't done. I mean, they weren't penalized if they didn't produce a report. They weren't penalized if they didn't make progress. But a number of the companies, really dozens of the companies that swore they were going to implement these things, had Equal Opportunity Act cases against them in American courts that they'd lost. So in the US, where it was the law, they were violating the law and being taken to court and losing in court. While they said in South Africa, it's voluntary, and of course they're going to do it. So I had a whole list at the back of my book of those corporations that are in South Africa that had, been found to have violated the EEOC laws here.
I see. In your chapter second, you talk about the strategy role of the Sullivan signatures. How did you explain that chapter?
I'm sorry, the strategy of what?
Of Sullivan signatures.
Oh, the signatures. Yeah.
Yes. How did you, what were you able to talk about in that chapter, your chapter
Okay.
second
Tell
of the
me
book?
what chapter is
The
this?
strategy role of Sullivan signatures.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what I was trying to explain, that the,
Mm.
motor vehicles industry, well, I could give more detail. They were providing vehicles and tires to the South African military and police.
Mm.
Um, and also they could be changed over, and we know this to be true in the US during World War II. They could easily be changed from producing civilian to producing military vehicles. We did that in our industries here during World War II. And it's South African law that that if the government says there's an emergency and they need those companies to turn over their operations to the government or themselves produce the military vehicles, then they will do that. And American subsidiaries in South Africa abide by South African law, not US law. And so, yeah. Okay. Then the computer industry ran the pass laws. That's, the passes for Blacks to travel in and out of the white areas. They ran the prison system. They ran all the banks and the businesses, and without American computers, South Africa would have collapsed, as an industrialized country. Everything was run by computers. I mean, that's a lot more sophisticated now, but even then, there were computer databases that, were used, and they were almost all 70% of the computer market was held by the US. The energy industry, mostly petroleum, but also nuclear energy. Again, American companies dominated that. And South Africa doesn't have oil, and so they started not only investing in nuclear power, but also into turning coal into oil. And the US was very much involved in those projects. And then the military apparatus, as I said, they used US made motor vehicles, they used computers. So this is the section where I was showing that this is what needs to be addressed. If we really want to get rid of apartheid, this is what we need to be addressing, not, whether Blacks and whites can use the same bathroom. As Bishop Desmond Tutu, a very famous famous anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, said, the Sullivan Principles are like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And other people said to me when I visited we're not dying because we're not dying when the South African police are killing us, and we're not dying because we want to use the same bathrooms as whites.
I see.
Yeah.
In your chapter 3, you talk about improvement upon apartheid, and you talk about commission that was formed. What was the role of those commissions?
Yeah, again, they were ways to figure out how to make reforms that wouldn't eat into profits, but could save the whole system. That they had to give up a little that was superficial and not really that important. Again, like desegregation, in order to preserve the whole system. And again, I think of the case of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt, who we all always look back at, as starting the public works projects and a social safety network and all of these things that we've come to depend on and build on. We ultimately had Social Security and Medicare and all of these government provided services. He did it in part because he cared about American people who were really suffering during the Depression, but in part to save the free enterprise system, to convince people not to turn to communism, which was providing a lot of those state services. So he was essentially reforming capitalism in order to save it. And the French did the same thing, right? In the 1950s in their colonies in Africa, they started to give more voting rights, and they started to allow more autonomous local government on very local issues. But they still controlled the economy, and they controlled foreign policy, and they controlled the really important things still. But they thought, well, if they mete out some of this to appease the populace who is in revolt at the lower levels, that they could preserve the empire, in a different way. I mean, they call it the Union of France instead of the Empire of France. And obviously the Africans and the Asians were expected to play very subsidiary roles.
Many
So it's the same thing.
many people may say, including the corporations, they may say that we are in South Africa to make a profit.
Yes.
But beside making profit, we provide jobs to Africans and color people. So our enterprise is not all negative. What did you say? What is your position on those views?
Well, it is true that even the worst paid Black workers in these American corporations was better off than his fellow unemployed people in the urban townships and in the rural areas. There's no question about that. But they were, as I said, 0.2% of the African labor force. So they are providing really very few jobs. These are a lot of them high-tech industries that required advanced degrees. Africans weren't allowed to get those degrees. There were trade union agreements with white unions that kept them out of certain jobs. So really it's a matter of weighing the costs and benefits of each thing, that the amount of damage that was done by these corporations in sustaining apartheid far outweighed the good that they did for the employment of so few Africans. Now, certainly there were Africans who didn't want to lose that privilege, and they might have opposed corporate withdrawal, et cetera. But so many of the people that I met, even working at the American company, said, look, I want apartheid to end. I want more equality for more people. They can't buy me off by giving me one of these jobs. I'm willing to die for this. And I'm willing to suffer the impact of sanctions or the impact of losing my job if it will help bring about a new South Africa that's democratic.
I see.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're going to find a difference of opinion. And the
Mm.
South African government was trying very hard, to create what they called the black buffer class of relatively privileged Africans when compared to other Africans, but not at all privileged when compared to the whites or people of mixed race or of South Asian descent. I mean, there was a whole hierarchy. It wasn't just Africans and whites, but there was a whole hierarchy of, the mixed race and that had many categories within it. There were sort of stairs in the hierarchy, and then people of mixed race, and some of them were kind of bought off that they were treated better than the African masses, and didn't want to lose that. But others, joined the struggle against apartheid as well.
So, what was the status and situation of color people who are the Indian, the Asians? How did they were
Yeah.
defined in the system?
Well, they interestingly in the corporate compliance reports, they just say blacks and they mean everyone who isn't white.
Okay.
And so that was another way they disguised the pathetic situation of the Africans in the American corporations, because they mixed in the more privileged mixed race and Asian people in the statistics. So it may be that all the supervisors were of Indian descent, or all of the supervisors, in the Western Cape were mixed race, and none were Zulu or Xhosa or Sotho or Swazi, etc. So that was a problem with the compliance reports, but they didn't have reservations. They were considered South African citizens, but not in any way first class citizens. They lived in segregated towns in white South Africa. So there'd be an Indian town and a mixed race. They called it colored town. Um, and they were clearly better off financially than the Africans who were in real slums outside of the city, and then in the rural areas.
I see.
Yeah.
So eventually, mm, after your hard work related to your book, Decoding Corporate Camouflage, your book was banned by the
And
South
yeah,
African government. How did you
yeah.
perceive that action?
Well, I was honored, quite frankly. I thought, oh, I guess I hit the mark. Yeah, it was illegal. I don't know that it was illegal to possess it. But I know it was illegal to sell it or distribute it. And what had happened was, after I left South Africa, and the book was already out, and that's why I didn't think I'd get a visa. It had gotten some press, but in both the white and black press, in 1980, before I went. So and then a nun, also from the Maryknoll Order, I mentioned the Maryknoll magazine. She had a copy of that book, and she told me that I should take it. And well, she gave it to a second person who gave it to me and said I should take it and be very careful, but I needed to show it to people, or no one would ever talk to me. I'm a white person, and Reagan's president. And so I was showing it to people. So people kind of knew about this book. I was showing it to the trade unionists and the community activists. And when I got back, I mailed back 200 copies separately, one to each person.
Mm.
And obviously the post office opened it up and found some of these. I don't know if they found one or if they found them all pouring in, but some people didn't get their copies. So, and then shortly after that, I don't remember how I learned that it had been banned, but someone told me. There's an announcement in the Government Gazette. And it's listed there with all the communist materials, the Marx stuff that's banned and other things. So that was in 1981. So it was the year after the book came out, but the same year that I'd been there. I'd been there in May 81.
Mm.
Yeah,
Eventually, the apartheid regime was defeated
right,
and Nelson Mandela come to power.
right.
How did you experience that changing, that political change in South Africa, and what are your views about Africa right now? And did you
Sure.
have the chance to visit South Africa?
Yeah, well, I tried to go in 1990. Apartheid was still in effect until 1994, but
Mm.
1990 was also a very pivotal year. That's when Mandela and other leaders were released from prison, and also people who were South Africans who got into exile, often because they opposed the regime, often young white men who had been drafted to fight in the townships and also in the regional wars that South Africa was waging against its neighbors like Angola. Um, and Namibia. And so they were allowed to go back and without fear of prosecution, although some were assassinated. But I tried to go back then, and I sort of experienced what the Maryknoll editor and photographer had experienced, that there was never a no, but I just never heard from them. My visa application just sort of withered on the vine. So I didn't go back. And I did want to go back in 1994 as an election monitor. And in some ways, I still regret that I didn't, but I just had my son. And I just thought if something happened to me and here's this newborn baby. And I didn't go then. But I did have a chance to go, not until 2006. I went in 2006 and 2008, just for short periods. I gave some talks at the universities. One destination was Cape Town. And so I did a lot of touristy things around Cape Town and gave a talk at the university and met with graduate students and caught up with some of the activists I'd known in 1981 who lived in that area. But I also had the chance to go to Robben Island, the prison island off the coast of South Africa, where Nelson Mandela had been for so many years. He had been in prison for 27 years, but not all of that was on Robben Island, but a lot of the other ANC and Pan-Africanist Congress and South African Congress of Trade Unions, Black Consciousness Movement, a lot of those people did wind up on Robben Island. It's very moving to go there, and they've posted the names of the people who were well known and inhabited various cells, and so you see Mandela's tiny cell with his blanket on the floor, and um, you know it was just the garden where he worked, and sort of that had sort of sustained me. Also buried his memoirs he was working on secretly in the garden. So we saw where that was. And the people who led the tours were people who had been formerly incarcerated there. So sometimes they could show us their own cell. It was really powerful. Um, and then second trip I took was to Durban, which is on the Indian Ocean side, on the east coast of Africa. Again, I knew a lot of people who were there. And so, I got in touch with, a lot of people that I corresponded with off and on, since 1981, or there'd been a long period of silence, but I found them again. And that was very moving. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to Johannesburg, where I knew most of the people I knew were there. But yeah, so I didn't go back for an extended period. And my doctoral research, as I mentioned, was in Zimbabwe, which I was there in 1985, 86, and they had gotten independence in 1980. That is majority rule. And I went there because I knew I would not get into South Africa again to do my research for my doctorate. And I wanted to go back to Africa. I didn't want to just go to an archive in Britain and try to write about South Africa. But I knew that even if they would let me in, that I would probably endanger anyone I talked to because they'd be keeping track of me. And another reason for not going was that there was a cultural boycott of South Africa that the ANC had stood for, not wanting entertainers to go there or athletes to go there or academics to go there, but to really isolate the South African regime and make it hurt. And so it wasn't just economic isolation, but it was all these other things we were supposed to respect. And I wanted to respect that. I felt like my underground trip was sort of different, and I'd been sort of granted permission by the ANC to do it. But Yeah, so that was when I was last there. And how I feel today is like so many places that start out with these high level aspirations. There are obviously some changes for the better, no question about it, but there's still a really hierarchical society, of elites, which now have more African members than previously, but still massive impoverishment. And some of it is, to the blame of the leaders who kind of sold out. Not everybody has a Nelson Mandela or a Julius Nyerere, who will live simply and not sort of eat up the profits, aren't acquisitive materially, um, really continue to stand for what they fought for and believed in. There are a lot of other people who just leveraged it to, becoming rich people, the heads of corporations, still kind of taking from the underclasses and ignoring them. So it's very sad that that obviously happened in Zimbabwe as well. Doesn't happen everywhere, but South Africa has there's also the legacy of apartheid is going to take generations and generations and generations to correct. I mean, that's not something that can be done overnight, as we're seeing in our own country that the effects of slavery are still with us. I mean, the lack of inherited wealth that so many African Americans suffer from, and the continued discrimination and mass incarceration and all of these things. And this is again, you know, almost 200 years after the Civil War.
Mm.
You know, yeah.
So, what do you think can be done to improve the situation in South Africa, considering the fact everything is not like.
Well, it's not for us to do. I mean, right? It's the struggle of the people in South Africa. We're not a huge presence in South Africa right now. I looked it up before. When I was thinking about what I was going to say in the talk, and I mentioned that there had been 180 of the 500 Fortune 500 companies in South Africa. Of them, there are really, really few today. Just a handful of those companies, and they're companies that I'd never heard of. So, the computer industry is not dominated by the US. Motor vehicles is not dominated by the US. Energy is not dominated by the US. They're um, just, more high-tech things don't employ a lot of people. So when I guess one thing we did skip over is when the corporations finally decided to leave the American corporations, and that was in the mid 1980s. A modified sanctions resolution finally passed the U.S. Congress and became law, and it was pretty tame. I mean, it exempted a lot of things, but it did cause some harm to the apartheid government that was like plummeting anyway because of civil unrest. And when there's civil unrest, there's no longer profits. And when there are always strikes and when there's, violence and, bad business climate, corporations will withdraw. So it's not a coincidence that this comprehensive anti-apartheid act passed when it was no longer profitable to invest in South Africa. And the corporation said, oh, okay, we'll leave. We're going to leave because it's immoral to be there. We don't want to support the apartheid government. No, they're leaving because their profits were plummeting. And there were a lot better places to invest and do business than South Africa at that point. And then they never went back in. Now, I'm sure they could have been. I mean, they would have been welcomed in by the government that was trying to, post-apartheid government was trying very hard to raise money and get foreign currency that they could use to get bank loans and those sorts of things overseas. But they weren't interested. They had better opportunities in, Southeast Asia and Central America and et cetera.
Did you get any challenge related to your book? And can you share if there were challenges, um, idea that really challenged you on your conceptions that the corporation were sustaining
Uh,
apartheid regime?
um, the only major challenge that I can recollect is Leon Sullivan and his employee um, Purnell, who was the head of the monitoring group. They were very, very hostile to me, and claimed that you know, that my statistics weren't accurate. I mean, they sort of said, well, I, I, I have a friend who's got a PhD from Harvard Business School, and they can't figure out how she came up with these numbers. And this occurred when I was testifying before the Connecticut State Legislature that was trying to determine if they were going to um, go for sanctions and their pension funds and their state investments. And so I had to go home and do a step-by-step showcasing of what the report said and how I came up with these figures, which they accepted. So, it was a lot of extra work for me to show my complete step-by-step how I got those numbers. But that was the biggest challenge. And then other times, Sullivan and Purnell would just sort of badmouth me on various college campuses where they went to talk, and because usually it was the result of someone asking a question about what do they have to say about what I did. I know the report made an enemy of the president of the college where I had my first job, and sort of my involvement in the divestment movement and trying to put pressure on that college to divest played a factor in my not getting offered a tenure track job. That he really became quite hostile to me. So yeah, but that's it. I mean, other than the threatening phone calls I got from South Africans, which I could tell from their accents, they weren't challenging the report per se.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after going through all this process, talking about the book, what was the conclusion? What kind of solution were you trying to provide by spending, I'm guessing, months or years writing this book? What was the
Um,
outcome you were looking for?
I wasn't really, well, I was just looking for social change. I wasn't really thinking about the book per se as a goal. It was, you know, I wrote it for the divestment movement, divestment and corporate withdrawal movement, and it was very gratifying to see that it was widely used. I mean, to when people went to their college administrations, they went to their state legislatures. I got to testify at a few state legislatures about their investments, and that felt really good. I mean, I don't think the books I wrote after that ever made the same impact. And, they were the
Mm.
ones I wrote after I had a doctorate. And, certainly professors use them and students like a lot of them. And I try to write accessibly, but not simplistically, even if I'm doing something for an academic audience. And I know that that came from the writing I did in the anti-apartheid movement that was, not for people who were specialists in Africa, et cetera, but just sort of average citizens. Um, so it set up, I guess, the framework, the model that I would use for my other books. But I've not really thought of anything about any of the books other than we need to get the word out. My last two books were about foreign intervention in Africa, one during the Cold War and decolonization, and the other after the Cold War, so including the war on terror. And there, I mean, it's again, hopefully to get people to open their eyes and see what role the US has been playing in spite of what it says it's doing, what it's really doing, and how so many of the conflicts that we see in Africa have been, if not fomented by outsiders, but intensified and perpetuated by outsiders. And so we can't just blame the victim, which is sort of what we usually do. So I guess all of my books I've hoped would be used in some way by others for social change.
Social change.
Yeah.
Professor Elizabeth, again, thank you very much for joining me on the Human Right Tree. It was a, a great experience learning from your work, and I look forward to having you again in the near future to talk about your other books.
Thank you.
But
Thank you.
go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you so much.
Okay.
It's really been a pleasure.
All right. So I look forward to reaching out again.
Okay.
And thank you very much for joining me on the
All right.
Human Right Tree.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.